Good morning. I've said this before, but anytime you see me plugging in the computer before the sermon starts, it means I forgot to charge it last night. Hey, real quick, if you're joining us, first of all, if you're joining us online, we just watched a video about Adele. If you're in Adele, we just watched a video about you. And for all of you guys, thanks for going to Adele with us. I wanted to give a shout out real quick to the team. How cool to get to see what's going on down there. You know, they made a trip. You guys have been there. It's not like 15 minutes away. But to go see what God's doing down there and just see what is happening in a completely different part of the state. And that's exciting for me because that's not something that we have personally one-on-one done. That's something that God just laid on Roger and Jesse's heart and said, this is something we can do. And we're all learning together. That typically tends to be the way that we've done things in the past, is that we just jump, and somewhere between there and the ground we try to build a parachute. And so when we find people that are like that, we're like, yes. So we've been talking about this concept of God, and I'm not gonna review a lot because we have so much to get to this morning, but I want to read you a story. It's in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 15. It says that Naaman had come and he had leprosy, and he was a high-ranking person. He was an important person. And Elisha says to go dip in the river, and the river was gross and it was nasty. And he goes, well, I had rivers at home. Why did I have to come all the way over here for this? And Naaman's servant says, hey, if he would have said it, what are you risking by trying it? Goes to the river, he dips, he's healed. So now all of a sudden there's this conversion, there's this life change happening, and this is where we're going to pick up the story. It says, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God, that's Elisha. He stood before him and said, now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. So he's saying, I've converted. I believe what you said about your God. I believe it to be true. There's been a life change take place in Naaman's life. Verse 16, the prophet answered, and doesn't this sound, I'm going to read it, but doesn't this sound like an answer you would get in Powell, Butte, Oregon? When somebody shows up and goes, thank you so much, let me pay you. The prophet answered, as surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. Doesn't that sound like the culture that we live in? Like, let me pay you something. Nah. Don't worry about it. Catch you on the next one. I'm sure that you do the same for me. This socially, this is a very culturally relevant story because it sounds like us. It sounds like a world that we live in. But spiritually, when you understand what's going on here, it goes even deeper. One of our core values here at the church is that waterers get watered, and that's based on Proverbs 11:25. We're going to get that there in a second. That says, when we live in generosity, there's two ways, and listen, there's two ways to live in generosity. One is going, look, God, oh, hey, look at me, I'm giving. I gave that guy $5, look at me go, helped a guy change a tire, God, and it's like we've decided that God equals karma, which is not our religion at all, by the way. The other way is saying, God has given me so much. I've already been given so much. I've already been so blessed. I'm not doing hoping to receive. I've already received, so I'm just giving out of the abundance. See the difference between the two? To the person receiving, they don't care. Thank you. It's our responsibility to know where the generosity is coming from. Verse 20, it says, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, the master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, this foreigner, this person who represented them. Because remember, as people, if we're not careful, we're always trying to decide who is us and who is them. Politically, who is us, who is them. 1,000 sermons in that, but we'll come back to it. He was too easy on this Aramean by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I'll run after him and I'll get something from him. This is the servant now of Elisha. My master sent me to say, he catches up with him in verse 22, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing. Clothing was handmade. It was not an easy thing to come by. So it wasn't like give me a shirt and a pair of pants. I mean, it was a lot of times a set of clothes was all somebody might own. Verse 23, by all means, take 2 talents, said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then he tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. We see 2 completely separate veins of thought here. We've got Elisha who goes, I'm not taking any credit. I didn't heal you. All I did is tell you what God said. This is a transaction between you and God for the purpose of changing your life to God. Keep me out of it. Elisha is saying, don't give me any credit, don't give me any reward. No, absolutely not. I'm not going to accept a reward, and by somehow accepting a reward, take any amount of credit. Gehazi, he's thinking of things in terms of like, wait a minute, that's just going to be wasted. These are material things that are now going to leave the kingdom. They're going to go back to the air. Can't do it. So he chases after him, and it says that leprosy came to Gehazi. And I'm not going to go too far into that other than to say this, that we believe that through giving, through operating in this breathing in and breathing out form of life, that God provides life through the law of love. We've talked about it enough. You can watch the videos if you don't understand that. When we breathe in, and we breathe in, and we breathe in, and we never then breathe out, that it brings death. And then what happened in the Old Testament physically, we see happening in the New Testament in modern day spiritually. So Gehazi, he says, I'm going to be greedy, I'm going to keep it to myself, and death came upon him. It was a demonstration of what happens when we get so inward focused, introverted, we become little versions of the Dead Sea that take in and never give back out. Here it is again. I'm going to read it. Proverbs 11:25. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Waterers get watered. We're the conduit. We think of it as a conduit. Proverbs 22 verse 9 says, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Doesn't that sound like our church? God has blessed us. Not we give food away so that we'll be blessed. We've been so blessed that we literally just, for you guys that don't know, if you're watching online, if you don't know who we are, we give cows away. It can be more simple. It couldn't be more simple than that. Like, there's a lot of explanations of how we try to pay for it and how we try to make it work and how we are a benefit to the community with those cattle. Anybody know what's going on at the church this afternoon? Fundraiser for a horrific accident, but it's a way that a church is able to love a family that needs loved. But at the end of the day, we are giving food away. Not so that God will bless us, because God has blessed us. It's important to note the difference. See, I think what the Bible is not saying is be generous and I'll reward you, be greedy and I'll punish you. Isn't that? I have to be careful because I don't want to be critical, but I think that's kind of how I was maybe brought up believing. That God rewards you when you're generous and he punishes you when you're greedy, but he's saying life works when you're involved. Life begins to come to the surface when you operate according to the laws that were set in place. Okay. This is creating a huge social ripple in the United States. It's kind of funny. It's kind of funny because we live in a completely wealthy nation. If you are an American citizen, spoiler alert, you're already rich. That was an embarrassingly low number of amens. I'm gonna say it again. If you live in this nation, you are already globally abundantly wealthy. You need to amen that because sometimes you'll forget. You know why? Because right now politically we're trying to divide people into the wealthy and the poor within the wealthy country that we live in. And the narrative is rich people, they're just not doing their fair share. They don't care about you poor people. And then, hey guys, how about these people? They're over there just wanting all your tax money. Here, you've just pulled yourself up by the bootstraps. They don't understand the work that you've done. Maybe if they were as competent as you were, they'd have what you have. And it's this has and has not. It's this ripple. It's this division that's come to our country, which is so ironic because everybody has opportunity. We live better than kings lived 100 years ago. So this idea of like, oh, boo, hiss, the rich. Yeah, you. We're in a wealthy nation. But here's what's funny is the Bible discusses greed way more than it discusses sexual immorality. We have favorite sins that we like to pick on in the Christian faith. We have sins that are like, oh yeah, that one, outcast. But then at the same time, if somebody is caught up in greed, are you gonna call them on it? I'm not. So we have certain sins that we can pounce on, and then for some reason we have these other sins that the Bible makes a big deal that we just sort of give everybody a pass on. You know why? You know why we don't talk about greed a lot in church? Because we live in a greedy nation. Because we're rich. If this is making you uncomfortable, you're gonna hate this sermon. You know what I found to be true about greedy people? Almost without exception across the board. Here's what I have found about greedy people. If you, tell me about greedy people, I will. You know what all greedy people have in common? They're always richer than you. It doesn't matter where you're at on the ladder, you always point to somebody a little higher. Oh, if I had what that guy had. oh man, that guy, he needs to share his wealth. And then somebody's like, what about you? Well, I don't have what he has. Greedy people are always more wealthy than you. Here's what I'm willing to bet. From a biblical standpoint, 90% of us have an incorrect view of greed because we don't understand greed. It's allowing us to remain greedy. Can I say that again? That because we don't understand the biblical concept of greed, it's allowing us to remain greedy. We don't even like talking about greed. We're all subconsciously aware that we're more blessed than we deserve. And so when somebody brings up greed, instantly we're like, hold on, what am I going to have to give up? What are some traits, and I'm saying stereotypically, what are some traits of greedy people? In the American culture, how would you describe greedy people? One, rich, right? To be greedy, you have to be rich. You have to be selfish. You have to lack empathy. You have to lack, understanding for where the little guys go. You have to smoke cigars. I added that one. And, oh, by the way, they're all old and white. So, does that make you uncomfortable? Like, I'm just saying stereotypical. I'm just saying, what is the stereotypical description of like, oh, boo, hiss, greedy? We have got this mental image of what it takes, what it requires to be greedy. And if you're not those things, then you're like, whew, I'm in the clear. You think you're uncomfortable now. Oh my gosh, I don't know what got into me this week, but just Luke chapter 12, verse 13. It says that Jesus is walking through the crowd, and someone in the crowd says to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. So what is he asking for? Justice. He didn't say, tell my brother to give me everything that he deserves. All he says, it seems like a fair enough request, Jesus, tell my brother to behave justly. Now let me tell you, what you deem just and what someone else deems just can vary. Jesus replied, man, I don't know if your parents are like my parents, but if my parents ever started a sentence with, man, Jesus, man, who appointed me judge or arbiter between you? Does that sound like a typical Jesus answer? Jesus goes, I'm not your judge. This financial justice that you're demanding. But then he goes on to say this. Then he said, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Wouldn't that indicate there's more than one kind? All kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Now listen, this thing, because remember, we're trying to decide who is God actually. What's an actual view of God? What's the true version of God, right? And the problem is, without an accurate view of God, this, where we're going, is about to get super confusing. If for some reason, something were to happen to me and I can't finish this sermon after about 5 minutes from right now, somebody get up and read the rest of the notes, because it is very important that when we get through the next 5 minutes, then the next 5 minutes we have the opportunity to explain it. I hope I pique your curiosity, because you're in for it. Have you ever said this? I remember when I was a kid, and I love him dearly, a dear friend, Jackie Davenport. I worked for Jackie, and we installed septic systems. Clean ones, they weren't used. They were just holes in the ground. And I worked hard, and we woke up in the morning, and it was hot, and we would try to get as much work done as we could before it got hot, and then we would just keep working. One time, I wasn't paying attention, and he backfilled a hole that I was supposed to take a shovel out of, a $10 shovel, and I forgot, and the shovel stayed down there, and so he had time, so he goes, dig it up. His point was, he wanted me to remember the next time. He paid me whatever, $10 an hour, and he let me dig for 2 hours, so the cost of the shovel was tripled, and he never got the shovel back to teach me a lesson. Don't you love those moments? And as a kid, this isn't fair. I worked, and I remember I would have to tie rags around my head because I was so sweaty, the sweat would get in my eyes and it would burn. And I remember just thinking, like, man, I hope, God, this isn't the end. I hope this isn't what you've got for me. I hope I haven't discovered my calling in life, because this doesn't feel like a calling. But what was crazy is I did all the work he didn't want to do. That's why he paid me. And guess who made all the money? Not me. And I remember, you've been here. You remember your first job thinking, must be nice sitting up there in your air-conditioned office. Oh, must be nice looking down on us little people. If I had what you had, I'd be way more generous. If you have ever said, if I was up there where they were, then I would be more generous, by virtue of that statement alone, I can promise you, no, you wouldn't. Let me save you the effort of climbing the mountain only to discover what I'm going to tell you right now is that if you think you would be more generous based on what you have, no, you wouldn't, because that is not how generosity, nor is it how greed works. It's a broken theology to think, well, if you had what they had, you would be generous and you wouldn't be greedy. They're greedy because they have what they have and they don't share. That's not how greed or generosity works. Verse 16, then he gets it really uncomfortable. Here's my least favorite part of this sermon. It says, and then he told him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and I will store my surplus grain. So he says, I've had a great harvest. I go, oh, what am I going to do? I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger barns. And then it says that, rich people, right? This story is full of booby traps. It is full of just like, whoa. Listen, verse 19. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Verse 20, but God said, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God. Oh man, if I wanted to tell you that God was punitive and judgmental and he wanted to not do well, if I wanted to tell you that God wanted you to share everything and that socialism was actually a religion, if I wanted to go down that road, this is the story I would use. The problem is that's not what this story says. This story is not the beginning of Marxism. Thank you, Jesus. This story is told in a way that causes feathers to be ruffled. People listen to this story and they go, what? A rich man has a great harvest, and instead he doesn't have room to store it, so he builds bigger barns for himself, and then he dies, and he has no one to share it with. And listen, this story, I've heard this story told as like, and when you're greedy, God might kill you. What a harsh theology of like, oh, what if I have too much? Oh, the fear of like, oh, what if I have to, oh, I've been so blessed and what do I do with it? And oh, I got to hurry and give some of this away before God strikes me dead. That's not what's being said. Let me read it to you. Verse 19, this is where it starts. He says to himself, the rich man says, I have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. What he's discussing here is a values system. This guy, it's a peek, it's a view into this guy's heart that says, finally, the wealth will make me happy. Because of my wealth, now I'll be happy. Because of my wealth, now my life will be perfect. It's a little screenshot into the heart of this rich guy. Not that having a good harvest was his problem. The problem was the value that he placed on this good harvest. Remember last week we talked about internal idolatry, external idolatry. We don't suffer with that anymore because we're far too intelligent. Internal idolatry is anything that we look at in our heart of hearts, we go, if we could accomplish that, if we could achieve that, then our life would have purpose. Then our life would have meaning. Then I would be somebody. That is idolatry. So it's a viewpoint that says that this guy is suffering from an internal idolatry, what wealth would provide him. He's saying, listen, because of my wealth, I'll be happy now. That's where it starts. Verse 20 says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? There's a lot hidden in this verse too, because he's saying, it didn't say that God's like, that's it. I'm gonna kill you. I've heard that sermon preached from a pulpit in a church. That's not what it says. It just so happens that in the midst of things going well, this guy's clock runs out. That's it. That's all it says. That this guy's life ends at a time where he is prospering. And it says the problem is, the perspective is that you are going to die with all of this wealth, but who gets it? That indicates that he was not surrounded with healthy people. He was not surrounded with a family. It doesn't say that your family's going to benefit or you've been a huge blessing to the people that work for you. It says you strictly and solely placed your focus on wealth, and then you pass away, and what comes of it? Are you following me? Do you see the difference here? He's not saying shame on you for having. He's saying shame on you for what you thought having would bring you. It does not say as punishment for storing up your wealth, you're a goner. How do you explain Proverbs chapter 30 that says, ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up food for the summer? Also, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. God also talks about being lazy. Verse 7, it has no commander, no overseer or ruler. Verse 8, yet it stores its provisions in the summer and gathers its food in the harvest. So God can't say, shame on you for gathering up the result of your labor, because it's saying, look at the ant and pay attention. Don't be lazy. Look at how the ant operates. The problem was not that he had stored up wealth. The secret to this story is in verse 21. Listen, it says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but... it's an important word. Stores up things for themselves, however, breathes in for themselves, but is not rich toward God. What does that even mean? It says, this is how it will be with people who place so much focus on wealth, the breathing in process of gaining, without ever considering the breathing out of being a blessing, using what God's given you to the purpose of God's kingdom. That doesn't mean that you are required to go give everything away. That's usually how you identify rich people in congregation. You don't have to give everything away. Amen. Here's greed. Let me give you greed, okay? If you want to know what greed is it the rich guy up in the office that just stores everything up for himself? Maybe. But here's the problem with money. It can trip you up whether you have it or whether you don't. Provisions and resources and wealth, they can trip you up when you have it because your confidence gets overinflated. Or it can trip you up when you don't have it because of the confidence you place in what will happen when you get it. Everyone is susceptible to greed. Greed is this. This parable tells us that life is pointless for the man who believes that everything, listen to me, everything that God brings into his hands was intended for his own consumption. That is greed. That is greed, believing that God hands you something and everything that God gives you is intended for your own consumption. That is the definition of greed. John chapter 6 says, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, now listen, this is funny. This proves to me that Jesus had just listen to his sense of humor. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him because he already had in mind what he was going to do. So he already knew what he was going to do, but he sees all these people and he says to his disciples, oh man, how are we going to feed them? Philip answered, it would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. So he's like, what are we going to do? And the disciples are like, we don't know. These stories are more fun when you really stop and consider the context of what's going on. Another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Last week we talked about Samson, that Samson had been given so much. Samson had so much to offer. He had strength. He was smart. He was cunning. He was all of these things. He's a great warrior. He was a great leader. He had draw. People are drawn to Samson. Samson, listen to me, Samson had so much to offer. But the problem was Samson thought that everything that God gave him was for him. Can I say that again? Samson believed that everything that God placed into his hands was for Samson's consumption. He used his strength for personal vendettas. He used his strength to pay back personal revenge. He used his strength to take it out on the Philistines, but only once he was angry with something that they had done to him. He was all about himself. Everything that Samson did was self-focused. Samson was suffering with breathing in and never breathing out. He was the one running down the Aramean going, hey, you can give me some of that reward. I mean, I'm doing some things over here and I'm acting. And he's never considering that God placed it in his hands for the purpose of the use of the children of Israel. Samson was one person reflecting an entire nation. Okay, so you got Samson? Well, here's the other half of that. I think it's a sister story. Even though I've never heard Samson compared to this story before, I believe the two are tied together. Here's why. Because now we see a little boy and he's got almost nothing to offer. Here's a little boy who's carrying his lunch. And let me tell you, if Jesus says, hey, I want your lunch, you can go, oh, my lunch? Because I'm looking around. I don't see anybody else whose mom had a little forethought and packed him a lunch. Legally, could the little boy have defended keeping his lunch for himself? I'm asking again. You need to answer because you're being set up. I'm warning you. Legally, could the little boy say, no, this is my lunch and you can't take it? Could he have said that? So will the government ever be the solution to how the people take care of each other? Oh, burn. This is not a political problem. We are not being forced to give under compulsion that says, you rich people are always this way, and you poor people are. Legally, the little kid could have said, no, this is mine. It's all I have to offer, but it's all I have. So I'm just going to brought into my hands. It's meant for my own consumption. Let me ask you something. Was the little boy generous? No, he wasn't. Trick question. He was not generous. He was obedient. When you are acting in obedience, stop patting yourself on the back for being generous. You're not. You are not generous if you're being obedient. Whew, that's a whole sermon. Stop going, oh, I guess I gave a little bit. God told me to give some money away and I did. It's not generosity, it's obedience. We don't understand generosity because we don't understand greed. We can't possibly understand generosity unless we first understand how greed works. That sometimes God gives you something that says, hang on to that, but I want it back. Hold on to this for me, but it's not yours. I'm going to bring something to your path, but you hang on to it, and when I ask for it back, I want you to give it back. If you give it back, you're not generous. You're obedient. Verse 10, Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there, plus women and children. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Everybody had as much as they wanted. Does that include the little boy? Little boy wasn't generous. He was obedient, and because he was obedient, he had more to eat than he had when he started. As much as they wanted. It says that because the little boy was holding on to some food for Jesus, because Jesus, let me tell you, Jesus didn't go, He knew the little boy was there. He knew the fish was there. He knew the bread was there. He could tell you the trees that the wheat was milled from. He could tell you where the fish were born. He could tell you the whole process. Why? Because Jesus put together the opportunity for the little boy. The little boy didn't put together the opportunity for Jesus. I'm going to say it again. We always think of this as the little boy created an opportunity for Jesus. No, Jesus created opportunity for the little boy, and the little boy obeyed. In your life, I think the battles that we face are sometimes we think we're just being really generous, and we're not considering that not everything God placed in your hands was meant for your consumption. We have a little post office here in town. What would happen if the postmaster brings you half of your mail and goes, there? We gave away half of our mail today. Now think of this, think of it. We gave away half of all of our mail today. We just gave it away. No, you stole half of the mail. You didn't give away half of your mail. You stole half of my mail. That's not generosity. Okay, fine. Post office, okay, fine. You know what? Fine. Tomorrow, we're just going to give away all of the mail because that's how generous. No, that's not how generosity works. You're required, you are expected to give away what was given to you to hand off. That's how the post office works. You get paid for it. You get paid to hand off things that were given to you for someone else. I expected that the amens would plummet right about now because people are like, oh yeah, amen. Oh no. Because what happens when God does that in your life? So much easier. Oh, the post office, the government, they better bring me my mail. What about when God puts fish in your hands for someone else's consumption? This is way less fun. Greed has nothing to do with wealth. Nothing. I think the problem is so many times that God goes, hey, hang on to this for a minute. And then he goes, okay, I need that back. And you're like, oh, you mean my stuff? I work hard. I work 70 hours this week, manual labor. And you're going to tell me I have to give it away? I'm not telling you that you have to give anything away that belongs to you. say that again? I just feel like this sermon is full of I would never ask you to give away anything that belonged to you. But the only way you're ever going to be considered generous, the only way that you're going to be blessed as generous is if you give away something that rightfully belonged to you. You're not generous if you give back something that never belonged to you. I feel like I'm walking on hot coals, but I know they're true. I know it's true. Colossians was not written to wealthy people. Colossians was written to just the average working class people. But it says this, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is, does anybody want to guess what the next word is? Idolatry. Greed, the reason we don't understand greed is because we don't see greed as idolatry, but the Bible says greed is idolatry. The thought that everything that comes to you is for you is idolatry. It's that everything that you have is how you survive. That you survive, that you're provided for, that your provisions are held within what you possess. That is idolatry, that I will take care of myself. When God says you can't serve the God of more than enough and the God of never enough. You cannot. You will love one and hate the other. You can't serve both God and mammon. Or you can't serve both God and money. Why? Because money is the God of never enough. Is money bad for you? Absolutely not. It's just when you don't think you have enough of it. The appetite for more is what is damaging. This idea that I don't know how much I need, but I got to save up for myself because I'm self-preserving. Remember, fear is self-preserving. Love is continually giving. Oh, man. Listen, I know that I'm the one preaching it. This is a great sermon. This is a great sermon. You know why? Because I don't even like it. I don't even like hearing it because it exposes things in my life that I'm like, What does he say? He says, just be aware of your greed. Dislike your, no, it says put to death. Actively seek to put to death your greed. Why? Because your greed is killing you. Your greed is severing you from God. Your greed is driving you to work while someone else raises your kids. Your greed is driving you to run out on your wife because you think that everything that's brought to you is meant for your own consumption. It is turning you into somebody that is so inwardly focused you can't possibly live. Your greed is killing you. Let me tell you, nobody likes the idea of surgery that goes in and removes things that are killing you. But why do people do it? Because it's worth it. Why do people have surgery where people go in and take out large amounts of their body, but it's because they're full of cancerous cells? It's because there's a desire to live. And that's what he's saying in Colossians is go in, identify your greed, and kill it. That is not a passive approach. Nobody, well, I'm sure there has been somebody, but it's not typical for somebody to go, you know what, listen, and this is not to take cancer lighthearted or any sort of disease, but I don't know of anybody who's going, I've got cancer, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just aggressively dislike it. We'll see how that goes. I have cancer, so you know what I'm going to do to deal with it? I'm going to confess it. Okay. And then what? Oh, that's it. You sit down with a team of doctors, you sit down with a team of medical professionals, you go, I have something that's killing me, so what do I do with it? What's the plan of action? What do I need to prepare? What sacrifices do I need to prepare to make so that it doesn't go further? And Colossians is saying identify the cancer and aggressively treat it because it is bad for you. Okay, so how do you treat it? I am glad I asked for you. Malachi 3:8. Church people go, oh no, it's Malachi 3. Yeah, it is. It says, will a mere mortal rob God, yet you rob me? You know where this is going. Now listen, I will say this. If you cannot bring yourself to pay tithe, if you just cannot get there, if you just cannot get to a place where you can write 10% of the increase, because that's God proving that greed could apply to anybody. He didn't say the rich people pay 25%, the poor people, they pay 1%. So just whatever the increase is, you just pay tithe on that. You're like, wait a minute, this is just all of a sudden turned to money. Yes, it has for a second. If you just can't bring yourself to pay tithe to a church, hard pause, I would encourage you to do this instead. If you just can't do it, I cannot pay tithes. I just don't have enough money. I just can't afford it. If I do this, blah, 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 blah. All the things that we say when we can't pay tithe. Here's what I would encourage you to do. Take 10% of the increase, rip it up, and throw it in the garbage then. Just get rid of it. Here's why. Because if you're unwilling to acknowledge that sometimes God puts things in your hands that are not meant for your own consumption, you are so caught up in your greed that you can't possibly be living a life that reflects the love that God has. It says, I've got plenty more. So before we go on some high horse about you need to be paying tithe to this church so that, hey, can I promise you something? I just don't think I ever see God challenging me to raise $54 million for a private jet. Okay, there, I said it. Stop, that's ugly. No one's gonna bounce up and down on a stage and scream, pay your tithe for the benefit of the church. What greed says is acknowledge that not everything that God puts in your hands was meant for your own consumption for your sake. Breathe in, breathe out, plug yourself into life, be a part of a system that lives and that operates. Stop thinking, well, God gave it to me, it's mine. Not because of me, because of you. For your sake. But you ask, how are we robbing you? God says in tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me. Now, under a curse, does that mean that God's punishing them? I believe it says this, you are not living. You are pursuing fear. You are firing the amygdala in your brain. The fear centers in your brain are going nuts. You are living under a curse because you are so fearful and you will not do the things required to take the steps to get out of that. It says, take the step necessary. Identify the greed in your life. And listen, it's 10%. It's 10%. It's 10% of the increase. If you don't know how tithe works, and it says this, if you go, okay, well, I do some things, like I give to the local, animal shelter. Good. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says specifically that, oh my gosh, listen, can I perspective? Because remember, we're all in a rich nation. If you went to the streets and with people that had nothing, I mean nothing, people that were living hand to mouth from whatever people give them, and I said, God says that he will bless you, but you've got to give up what you've got. Okay. Why is this hard? Why is this hard to hear? Because you acknowledge that you've been given more than you deserve. We all have. The reason it stings is we want to justify keeping it. The rich young ruler said, what do I have to do? And Jesus says that your money is the alcohol to the alcoholic. Your money has become drugs to the drug addict. Your money has become the gambling to a gambling addict. What you have placed on the value of your money is killing you. And if you will go and have surgery and remove the thing that is keeping your heart from being submitted to me, and the guy goes, I can't do that. This is a hard sermon to hear because we are rich. That's hard to hear. That's hard to say. You're rich. I'm rich. We're rich. This is not a fun sermon to preach because people go, well, if I have what somebody else had, but the Bible says we are robbing God when we believe that everything brought to us was intended for our own consumption. We are suffering in greed. We can't even get to generosity because we haven't even gotten out of our greed. When we pay our 10%, we are obedient. We are not even yet generous. I hate it as much as you do. I was fortunate to have parents that at an early age, they took a very legalistic approach to tithing. Thank God. Like if I made 10 cents, I had to go find a penny somewhere. It was just woven into my DNA. I grew up with it. I realized the difficulty of somebody going, now I have to start paying tithe. I've been living on 100%. The problem is you're not living on your own money. God said, here, hang on to this for me because someday I'm going to ask you to give it back, and I want to make sure you know that you have greed. God didn't say, I needed that. God's saying, I needed you to see it. I needed you to know what greed was doing in your life. You need to be able to identify it. I'm going to live with or without it. Because let me tell you, greed is more damaging to the person who holds than from who has it withheld. Does that make sense? When a greedy person holds on to something, it's more damaging for them than the person it was withheld from. Oh, I got to get through this sermon. Remember, Samson was one man, but he represented a nation. I don't know how many people would call this church home, but I know it's a lot. And listen, our church, do you know the average demographics for our church, for our region, for the state, for the income, for all that. Listen, our church, if we were a statistical average, would be running 20 people. The average age in the high 70s, 80% women. That's what our church is supposed to be. So when we look around, it would be so easy to believe that everything that God has brought here is proof of how good a job we're doing. But just like Samson was one that represented thousands, what I believe is this: God is going to bring things into this church that were not intended to stay here. God might have brought you into this church and you're not intended to stay here. You are going to have a fire lit under you like Roger and Jesse Burley, that God moves and they go, what am I going to do now? And God says, I want to go through you for the benefit of somebody else. Why are we capitalizing on video campuses? Why are we looking outside of our walls? Why have we given 40,000 pounds of hamburger away? Because we recognize it wasn't ours. I can't ask people to participate in something if a church won't participate in something. I don't know what our giving is. I'm telling you, I wish I had the numbers. In fact, I should probably ask Lacey before the second service. But I know that we don't give 10% away. I know that it has times been double that. There are times it's been more than that because it's a heartbeat. It's a desire to see people brought in from outside. It's a desire that says, God, don't let us hang on to anything that's bad for us. Whatever it takes, take it. So that when I stand in front of a congregation and I say, if you pay your tithe, you're not generous, they don't throw rocks at me. If you pay your tithes, and that's it. Because Malachi 3:10 says, bring your whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I won't bless you. See if I won't turn things around. See if plugging into life doesn't create life. See if plugging in the lamp doesn't cause the light bulb to come on in your life. And I want to close with this. And I'm going to tell you, I went long. You guys, probably should have been 2 sermons. But I do know this. I know that no matter what I say, no matter how I act, no matter what I read, I have none, to change the way that you think. You and you alone decide how you think. All I want you to do is I want you to go home and I want you to consider this. Says, God, what have you given me? I read a letter this week, secular website about a secular issue, but there was a trans person who was in jail, and he wrote this letter and he said, all I'm looking for is someone who will be my friend. For all the issues that are going on in his life, what he's looking for is somebody who will give, hey, do you have any time? Do you have some time? Do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 5 minutes to stop and pray for somebody? Do you have 5 minutes to stop and invest into somebody else's life? And the problem is so often we pass these opportunities because we believe everything that God brought to us is for our own consumption. And I'm going to challenge us to be people who go, God, what have you brought to me that's intended for somebody else? Let's pray. Lord, I know that this is just a lot. There's a lot to take in here, but in reality, God, we can't, how often do we call ourselves generous when we give back something that didn't even belong to us? When we're willing to give back something that wasn't even ours, and then we want brownie points for generosity. And God, it's like we've turned everything about who you are into karma, and we don't even believe in that. But God, if we want to get into the verses that say that generosity brings prosperity, if we want to even get into that, we've got to get out of the red. We've got to get out of the things that are holding us, that are handcuffing us to our own greed. The areas in our lives where we're serving the God of never enough, whether it's with our time, our resources, our money, whatever the case may be, help us to identify where we have allowed greed to set up shop in our lives. And just like it says in Colossians chapter 3, God, allow us to attack and not just be passive, but address it head on. God, when we do that, it changes the DNA of the church. It changes the DNA of who we are. But the church as one can't change unless you begin to permeate through the lives of the individuals that call this place home.